Good morning, everyone. We're going to let everyone kind of get settled and probably start the workshop about 10:05. Good morning for anybody just joining us. We're going to get started about 10:05. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming to the Proposition 1 Cycle 5 applicant orientation today. This is the second of two workshops in advance of our concept proposal submission deadline. Excuse me. So just to start, our executive officer, Campbell Ingram, is going to kick us off with a few remarks.
Few words of welcome. Thank you, Shelley. Again, Campbell Ingram, Executive Officer of the Delta Conservancy. I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here today and for participating. And thank you for your interest in doing ecosystem restoration work in the Delta. The Conservancy, we're very proud of the 30+ projects that we now have out in the Delta, both doing ecosystem restoration and more recently some economic development. Each one of those projects, particularly the ecosystem restoration projects, are actively providing improved ecological function and contributing to very important ecosystem restoration goals in the Delta. And our Prop 68 projects are contributing to economic development goals in the Delta as well. Probably not most importantly, but equally important, each one of those projects has very strong demonstrated local support, which is a very important component of the work that we do at the Delta Conservancy. But it is absolutely, and most importantly, a partnership, and you are a major component of that partnership. Our role is to solicit projects, review them, enter into grant agreements, and manage the grants. And your role, of course, is to actually do the heavy lifting and the work of actually doing the restoration in the Delta. So we greatly appreciate that partnership and appreciate your willingness to do that work. and look forward to hopefully working with you and providing the funding that enables you to do that important work. So today really is an opportunity for you to be better informed about the application process and answer any questions and get any answers to any questions that you may have to hopefully help you through the process. So with that, again, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Shelley Temple-King, the lead for the program, to run you through the program and answer any questions you've got. Thanks again.
Thanks, Campbell, and thank you for reminding me to introduce myself. I'm Shelley Temple-King, and I am the environmental scientist at the Conservancy working on the Proposition 1 program. So just quickly, the agenda for this workshop is welcome and introductions, a short overview of the Cycle 5 timeline and kind of the process that we go through, the major components of the concept proposal application as well as the full proposal application, how we review and score these applications, and some helpful tips that we've found, through our experiences. And we should have quite a lot of time for questions at the end. If you have a question that you think is applicable kind of to the broader audience, you're welcome to either raise your hand or ask to be unmuted to ask a question, or if you would prefer to drop a question in the chat, we can answer it that way. If the question seems to be pretty specific to your project, we may hold that over until the end of the workshop where we can give it a little bit more time and energy. Quickly, I just want to briefly introduce the folks from the Conservancy who are joining the workshop today. We have Martha Ozanoff, who is our grants and contract analyst. So if you have a project that is funded with us, you will get to hang out with Martha, who's awesome. There's Sarah Lesmeister, who is the Ecological and Community Programs Manager, overseeing both the Proposition 1 and Proposition 68 programs, as well as special science projects. Rachel Wigginton, who's our Senior Environmental Scientist, who is also our CEQA lead. So she is a go-to if you have CEQA questions particularly. And let me scroll through here. And then we also have Robin Crack joining us, who is the lead for our Proposition 68 program. Next slide, please. So the timeline, for Cycle 5, our submission period for the concept proposal is going on now. So you're welcome to submit a concept proposal anytime before or on to August 31st at 5 p.m. We'll then spend the next couple of months reviewing those concept proposals and really diving in with applicants, with all of you, to give feedback on your concept proposal, trying to make sure that when you submit a full proposal, it is the most fundable proposal possible. So during the concept proposal submission period and the concept proposal review period, the Conservancy staff are all here for any applicant questions. If you want to bounce ideas off of us, all of that is completely fine. However, when we come to the full proposal submission date, so on October 26th, we are no longer available to you until after the full proposal review period and the announcement of awards. So please ask questions early when we're able to answer them. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. James, can we go back? I apologize. So the full proposal, the deadline for full proposal submissions is December 15th. And then we'll spend the next couple of months reviewing and scoring those proposals and then making recommendations for awards for our spring board meeting. And now I'm ready for the next slide, please, James. Thank you. So during the concept proposal submission period. This is the time for applicants to prepare and submit your concept proposals. Following the submission period is the review period. And so that's when we review concept proposals. We'll meet with applicants, we'll discuss your concept proposals. Again, we'll try to really refine your projects. And then for the full proposal submission, each applicant can decide if they want to prepare and submit a full proposal. We don't score the concept proposals, but we do give qualitative feedback. Again, during the full proposal submission period, there is no communication between the Conservancy and the applicants, and that extends into the full proposal review when we and external reviewers review the proposals and again, have no communication. Awards will again happen in spring of 2022. So Conservancy staff will make recommendations to our board, and then the board will vote on those proposals. Just after that, if your project has been awarded, you'll receive notification. Next slide, please, James. So the major application components, the first really is just eligibility. So we need for you to make sure that you're eligible for one of these grants. And so there are a few major pieces of eligibility. The first is the California bond law. And so really the most essential portion of that for applicants is that any kind of planning that's being done, so particularly planning projects and pilot projects, must lead to an on-the-ground capital outlay project. And I will repeat this later, but it needs to be very clear that whatever planning is happening is going to lead to a capital outlay project, and also clear how the planning will lead to a capital outlay project. We primarily fund projects within the legal delta and the Sassoon Marsh. If you're proposing a project that's outside the legal delta, your proposal will need to include additional information, such as the alignment with the ecosystem goals of the Delta Plan, and then also benefits of the project to the Delta. Several types of entities are may apply for Proposition 1 funding, but please note that there are specific requirements for each type of entity, and those are outlined within the full proposal application. Next slide, please. Pardon me. So in the concept proposal, really this is a chance for agency staff to get a sense of the project that you are proposing. And then in the full proposal, we ask you to expand on that proposal quite a lot. So the major components of this are the proposal. So the proposal is a fillable Microsoft Word form. And then there is also an additional budget table file that is a Microsoft Excel document. The proposal needs to be submitted as a PDF document after being completed. And you may combine all of the files that you're submitting into one PDF with the exception of the budget tables. Please, for both the concept proposal and the full proposal, submit those as an Excel document. In your proposal application, you'll be asked to enter basic project and applicant information, as well as a more detailed project description, a management plan, a readiness assessment, the scientific merit of the project, and how you will monitor and assess project success. The map of your project should be sufficiently detailed so that reviewers are able to orient themselves to the location of the project with respect to the Delta. Additionally, the map needs to provide enough information that reviewers can gauge the general project boundaries. The Conservancy has a commitment to access and inclusion, so we request that applicants provide maps that are as accessible as possible. The budget workbook for the concept proposal is very similar to the workbook from cycle 4, but just as a heads up, and I will talk about this more on the next slide, the full proposal budget workbook has changed substantially. So just as something to keep in mind. In the performance measures table, which is required for pilot and implementation projects, each project objective needs to be listed, as well as the associated outputs, which are the things you're going to do during the project funding term. And so that's the 3 years that you're proposing funding. And then the outcomes, so what the likely habitat and or ecosystem impacts will be that result from your project, as well as metrics for both outputs and outcomes. So how you will know if you're successful. Next slide, please. So the major application, or the full proposal, major application components, there are a lot more. I think if you submitted every single attachment that you could submit, you'd end up with like 50. So there are lots of potential components, but most of those, well, all of them really are applicable to different types of projects and not necessarily applicable to every project. So the full proposal will also be a fillable document and needs to be submitted as a PDF when it's completed. Responses will be in the form of pull-down menus, text boxes, radio boxes, and check boxes, depending on the type of prompt that the application is giving you. Depending on the specific conditions of your project, so the type of organization, the type of project, geography, you'll be asked to answer various sections of the application or select not applicable. Some sections of the proposal require the submission of additional documentation, such as a current negotiated indirect cost agreement, permitting status, CEQA status, and more. Acquisitions projects require substantially more documentation and have specific sections that must be completed as well. In the full proposal, you will expand on the narratives supplied in the concept proposal and provide in-depth documentation to support them. The budget section consists of a narrative, which is inside the proposal form, as well as an attached budget workbook and cost share commitment letters if you're proposing any sort of cost share or cost leverage. One modification to the list on the screen is that the list of appendices, and I do apologize for this, our application is a work in progress right now. And so the list of appendices, these will probably not all be actually appendices. However, all of the components that we are discussing and reviewing today are the same components that will be in the full application. They may just appear in a slightly different section. The schedule and list of deliverables is another Excel file. Please carefully consider the timing of the deliverables and build in allowances for unexpected issues within the 3-year funding term. One of the most common reasons for grantees to need changes to their grant agreement is to change deliverable dates, almost always to push them back. So just consider a reasonable timeline based on your project, with the understanding that things may not go according to plan for the whole project. The financial management systems questionnaire is one that I definitely want to speak to. So the table needs to be populated with the financial and organizational information. And this is a questionnaire that requires quite a bit of supporting documentation. So please make sure that all of that supporting documentation is provided. One of the, again, like another pitfall that we've seen is that, particularly because the financial management systems information doesn't tend to be the primary focus of grant managers. Generally, that's an organizational document and not one specific to your project. Sometimes it's not completely filled out, or some of the documentation is missing. And it's a common reason for grant agreements to be delayed in execution. And so we really want to make sure that we are efficient, so that what you're giving us is what we need, and then we're able to turn that around into an executed grant agreement as efficiently as possible. And so then if, again, these are just all as applicable, the status of any applicable environmental permits, the status and document information for applicable CEQA documents, and the status and document information for applicable covered action processes. And so those three components are tables within the proposal, but then they also require the submission of additional documentation depending on your answers in the table. Next slide. So some of the additional documentation, I would say all of these pieces are pretty important additional documentation, but the budget tables are certainly important. And as I mentioned in the concept proposal, the budget tables have changed substantially in the application from previous cycles. The good news is that if you are a current grantee, the budget tables look a whole lot like our current invoice template. And so hopefully it won't be too much of a shift. But again, the budget tables, they look like the invoice. One thing to mention that is really important about the budget tables is that you must have macros enabled for this Excel workbook in order for the budget tables to function properly. And that is the case both in the budget tables for the application and also for subsequent invoicing. The cost allocation plan, again, is another one of the financial documents, like the financial management systems questionnaire, which can, if not filled out thoroughly, can delay grant agreement execution. For applicable projects, you will need to submit the California Conservation Corps consultation. So this is for pilot and implementation projects with a hand labor component. And that's also a change from the last cycle that the Conservancy ran. The Corps has said now that for projects that don't have a hand labor component, they are not obligated to go through the Corps consultation process. The performance measures table. So this is the same table that appeared in the concept proposal, but we do expect that it is more detailed in the full proposal. And then for acquisition projects, we require an acquisition table along with the extra documentation that I mentioned in the previous slide. Next slide. And so that brings us to the application review and scoring. And so as we review these applications and score them, we're looking at some sort of big categories. So the first is the project description. So what is this project? Why is it important? How does it fit in the landscape? How does it potentially fit with other restoration or conservation projects in the adjacent area? Then for the project team, who is involved with executing the project? What experience do they have? Why are they the right team? The budget again, and so this category takes information from the proposal application, so the budget narrative, as well as the budget workbook. Within the budget workbook, we are also looking at cost share and cost leveraging. And so we're interested in both in-kind and cash cost share and cost leveraging. Cost share being like other funds from non-state agencies, and cost leveraging being funds from other state agencies. We're also looking for the alignment with state priorities. So how does this project support and further state priorities or other regional or local plans? What's the long-term viability of this project? We want to make sure as stewards of state funds that we're funding projects that are viable for as long as possible. And so we expect applicants to address the fate of the project after the grant funding term ends. So that's the 3-year funding term. And then after the grant term itself of 15 years, we want to know how this project is going to be maintained. In terms of readiness, applicants need to address when the project can realistically start, and what steps still need to be accomplished before the project can start. For local support, obviously in the Delta, local support is essential. And so we want to know who's supporting this project. What is the diversity of support for the project? So neighboring landowners, special districts, local municipalities, county departments, state agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits, community groups, etc. So scoring is higher for projects that can demonstrate a diversity of local support. And then finally, the scientific merit and performance measures. In this section, applicants address the scientific foundation for the project. And so, this becomes a lot of past research, and then, past project information. As part of this, we want to know how resilient to the effects of climate change the project will be. And then how also the project is contributing to reducing the impacts of climate change. We want to know what measurements will be used to determine if the project achieves its goals. And so that, falls into performance measures and needs to align with the performance measures table. What are the benchmarks that will be used to determine success? And then the last sort of component of the performance measures and scientific merit is adaptive management. So how will adaptive management be used to respond to any unexpected issues, which we all know will arise at some point during the project life. Next slide. So we put together a few helpful tips based on the last 4 cycles of this program in the hopes that, that they're helpful. So the first is to really clearly explain and separate the planning activities and the implementation the project will lead to. And so this goes back to the bond accountability and the bond regulations. So for any planning project, any pilot project, we need to very clearly see what the implementation project would be that derives from this project. And so I think as a piece of advice, I would say that tell us more about that than less, even if it seems a little redundant, because often that linkage is not as clear as it needs to be. Another tip is to provide your federal negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. This again is just to make the agreement execution process a little more smooth and a little more streamlined. If we have all of those documents at the beginning, there are no surprises for anyone later, and there's nothing to delay the execution of your agreement. This next one is link projects with larger frameworks or planning efforts. So for example, if your project is adjacent to a large restoration project or a conservation area, or if it falls into a conservation plan for a certain area, make sure that in your application, you show how what you're proposing for your project fits into sort of this broader framework or a broader planning effort. Communicate with us frequently, again, except during the full proposal submission and review periods when you may not communicate with us at all. So definitely do it more at the beginning so that we can help as much as possible. Next slide. So we should be on the helpful tips continued.
Sorry, hold on a second.
Okay, no worries, James.
I went back, sorry.
No, it's fine. I had a concern that it was me like doing something that I was not supposed to be doing. So the second set of tips, the first is to address each application prompt fully, even if it feels like some material may be repeated in separate sections. We have tried to limit redundancy in the application so that applicants are just asked for information once, if at all possible. But sometimes because of the review process, we do need applicants to answer something that maybe has been answered already in a previous section. Consult with the Delta Stewardship Council staff early to determine your proposal's consistency with the Delta plan, and this is for all projects. That's something that we recommend doing just as early as possible. And then when thinking about your performance measures, select both appropriate and attainable performance measures. And again, this is for pilot and implementation projects. But really make sure that you know exactly how you're going to measure your success, and that the performance measures that you are selecting will allow you to measure the success that you're trying to measure. Make sure you explain both the outputs and the outcomes clearly. And again, outputs are what you're doing during the funding term. Outcomes are the sort of bigger picture habitat results that could, realistically come from these outputs. And then this last one is actually really important, even though it's the last one. Explain why the costs in your budget are fair and reasonable. And so this goes into kind of the, oh my gosh, I lost the word. The purchase. Anybody want to jump in and help me? I lost the word. The purchasing plan for your organization, how you go about selecting contractors and subcontractors, and how you go about purchasing goods. And then why those subcontractors and or retailers are reasonable for you to be using, and that so that we know that you have considered both the people you're selecting, how you're selecting them, and then the fair market value for any of these costs. And again, with all of the financial components, these are things that help us execute your agreements more efficiently. Next slide, please. So for additional resources, we have the email address for submitting concept proposals. And once again, those are due August 31st by 5 p.m. If you have questions about the Delta plan, you can go to the Delta Stewardship Council's website. And then we have information about the Proposition 1 program on our website, including some applicant and grantee resources, some past workshops. This workshop will also be available, and the slides will also be available on the website. Next slide. And with that, I'm happy to open up to questions. And once again, you can ask questions in the chat, or you can ask questions by asking to be unmuted. It doesn't really matter to us.
Robert, actually, participants can unmute themselves, but yeah, if you do raise your hands, that's always more considered too. So Robert Eddings, you should be able to unmute yourself. Doesn't look like Robert is able to unmute himself, even though he does have his hand raised. He should be able to unmute himself. I prompted him to unmute himself, and he's still currently muted. So hold on a second, Robert. Yeah, Robert, I do have this section that says participants can unmute themselves. Let me just double check. Yeah, Robert, I mean, you may have a old Zoom client, and that might be the reason why you're having problems, but we do have it open for people to unmute themselves if they want to. Doug, you're currently unmuted. Do you have a question?
I did, yeah. I was going to jump in. Robert, I'm listening to get in. Just a quick question related to scientific merit. Kind of struggling with exactly what to write there with a project where we're basically removing invasive species and planting with native species. And so I guess we kind of look at that as, you know, that makes sense just as far as providing native habitat for wildlife, removing sort of the just removing those invasive species. And so I'm trying to figure out, what do we write for scientific merit? we see value there, but we need to really kind of go into a lot of detail of the merit of doing that kind of restoration.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I appreciate your question. So for something like that, scientific merit, we would expect to see like references to the literature of, successful successful outcomes from invasive species removal, especially planted with, natives. If you can find any references in the literature to removing kind of the habitat type, or the vegetation in the habitat type that you're looking at, and replacing it with the vegetation that you would like to replace in the same habitat type, that's really helpful. But basically, I would suggest finding references that have led you to the conclusion that you just stated about, that we have an understanding that removing invasives is good and replanting that area with natives is good, because there's quite a lot of scientific literature to support that.
Okay, thanks.
Shelley, you muted.
Thank you. And thank you to Zoom for letting me know right away. Robert's question was, I just want to confirm that the concept proposal is just an opportunity to get feedback from staff, not a selection process that will determine who is allowed to submit a full proposal. And so, yes, mostly. We do require that anybody who wants to submit a full proposal does submit a concept proposal. So in that capacity, it's required, and it does determine who can submit a full proposal, but the feedback on the concept proposal is not a determining factor in whether or not you can submit a full proposal. Does that answer your question, Robert? Okay, great.
Shelley, can you hear me?
I can.
This is Paul Dirksen from West Safeco, or from City of West Sacramento. I have a question about the fair and reasonable. So that seems a rather subjective on its face. And I want to know if this is more related to our procurement process rather than whether or not we're going out and doing like market research on some element or something that we need to purchase. I'm just trying to understand that, because like I said, fair and reasonable on its face seems rather subjective.
Yeah, you're right, it is. So yeah, I think that, and thank you, procurement was the word that I was searching so hard for earlier. It is mostly the procurement process. I mean, for, I don't know, like field supplies or something, we would want to make sure that you had an understanding that like whatever you were paying for these field supplies was a fair price. But the procurement process and the sort of the regulations of your agency surrounding hiring and contracting with subcontractors is the bigger portion of that. Did that answer your question, Paul?
I think so. How weighted is that in the overall selection, I guess? I mean, to me, it's almost like a thumbs up, thumbs down sort of thing. I can't tell from the conversation that we're having or how you go about your selection process. So that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah. So that is actually, I mean, that falls within budget, just kind of the greater budget scoring. Mostly, I would say, though, that the sort of the biggest issue isn't so much in scoring, but in agreement execution. So, we will assess the budget kind of as a holistic piece. So the narrative, the tables, any of the financial documentation that you've submitted. But the biggest issue tends to be during grant agreement execution. If we are uncertain, about the procurement process, or how certain subcontractors are being selected, or how you're choosing to purchase whatever thing you're choosing to purchase, then that can be more of an issue. But it is not so much like heavily weighted during the review process.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Did that satisfy your question? I just want to make sure that I'm offering an answer that is useful.
Shelley, I think what we're going to do is schedule a time to meet with you or somebody else and talk about our particular situation. I think it's germane to the entire audience. Thank you.
Okay, all right, I appreciate that, Paul. And just let me know when you want to schedule some time and we can definitely do that. It looks like Robert had another question in the chat. And this is about the federal negotiated rate. And Robert, I am going to have to table that question and get back to you. My initial thought is that would be okay to use. I'm sorry, I did not read that question out loud to anyone. Robert was asking, his organization recently switched to a 10% de minimis rate on federal grants because the rate wasn't large enough to warrant the additional staff time to document and maintain an NDIR. And so is that 10% de minimis rate acceptable? And my thought is that it is, but I will confirm that and get back to you.
Shelley, can you talk a little bit about the available funding this round and the cost leveraging, cost share, kind of the differences between those and how those correlate to the selection process? And how are they weighted in that process?
Yeah, let me make sure I have my scoring table pulled up so I give you accurate information. So first, your question about the available funding. There's about $3.1 million for this this solicitation period. And then, so, let's see. The budget has a point weight of 7. Cost share is 5 and cost leveraging is 3. And the only reason I'm bringing those up as individuals is that I want to highlight that 15 is like the highest maximum point scoring for any area of the application. And so together, the budget, the cost share, and cost leveraging add up to 15 possible points. And so for cost share, so that's private, federal, or local funding, we just have a scale. So if it's 40% or more of the proposed budget, you get all 5 points for that. If it's 31 to 44, 21 to 30 is 3 points, 11 to 20% is 2 points, 1 to 10% is 1 point, and less than 1% is 0 points. And the cost leveraging works in a very similar way. The maximum number of points is 3. And so that starts at 20% or more, and then trickles down in the same fashion as cost share. And so cost leveraging is like matching funds from, matching state funds. So that's just really the only difference between the two, is that one is non-state and one is state.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thanks. I guess one more question, sorry. You mentioned consulting with the Delta Stewardship Council early. We're planning on including that consultation as part of the permitting effort that would be part of the work of the grant that would be funded. Does that approach make sense to you, or do you think there needs to be consultation with the Delta Stewardship Council in advance of actually submitting the full proposal?
That is a question, Doug, that I am going to punt to Rachel, our senior environmental scientist, who handles all of our CEQA leading and permitting and all of those things to make sure that you get a totally accurate answer.
Okay, thanks.
So Doug, I assume your question was, what do you need to have done in order for there to be a concept proposal submission? And I would say for a planning grant, we would want just to see that you had like made contact and had a reasonable timeline, like that you really understood what went into that planning, like how long the planning horizon is for your project. Because some covered action processes might be really straightforward and quick. And other ones, depending on the project, might be much more complicated. So Shelley or Sarah, please step in to correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I would say for the concept proposal, just having thought about it and maybe having had an initial contact before you actually submit your full proposal to make sure you have a realistic idea of what the timeline would be. Okay,
that sounds good. This would be, it's kind of a combination planning implementation grant, because we've received funding already to get through the CEQA process. And so we have completed CEQA for the project, but then we'll be doing the rest of the permitting, endangered species, wetland permitting as part of this next phase. And then we'll implement once we get through that permitting. And we identified consultation with the Delta Stewardship Council as part of that permitting process. So I think what we do is just identify the timeline for that as part of the grant description.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think if you've already been through the CEQA process, that the covered action process shouldn't be like too complicated. I would throw that back to Shelley though, about sort of planning / implementation and how such a project would work for our proposal process.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I actually just asked Sarah this question as well as you all were talking. I'm not aware that we can fund projects that are some part planning and some part implementation, but I think this is a specific enough instance that maybe, Doug, we can set up some time to chat and see exactly what you're thinking of, and just to verify that your project meets the requirements for either a planning or implementation grant, and kind of move on from there.
Yeah, and I think I might have misspoke when I said planning and implementation. It's more permitting and implementation. The permitting, we've done all the planning already. We've identified all the detailed project components, gone through CEQA, received, completed that CEQA process, and now we're ready for implementation. We just need to secure some permits.
Okay, well, that sounds like something that we probably could fund, but let's talk about it either after your concept proposal submission or before if you want to.
Yeah, will do. Sounds good.
James, could you go to the next slide, please? So for anyone who doesn't have our contact information, this is it. You're welcome to email me or the Prop 1 grants email with any questions or concerns, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I know that we had a sort of specific question from someone on the line, a potential applicant, about using tribal cultural resource monitors. And so I am going to try to address that as well as I can. But everyone is welcome to go if that's not applicable to you. Unless you think of another question, you're welcome to stay on. We're here until noon. So you're welcome to stay as long as you want, but don't feel compelled if the questions are not addressing your specific issues at this point. And thanks so much for coming. I look forward to seeing everybody's concept proposals. So with regard to the question about having tribal cultural resource monitors, there definitely seems to be a precedent for that with other state grants. And so it does look like there is a standardized process and kind of payment agreement for tribal cultural resource monitors. And they do need to be used in conjunction with the standard archaeological monitors. So they are in addition to the archaeological monitors for cultural resources. Aaron, did you have other questions about that?
Yeah, maybe just one clarifying question. Do they need to be a subcontractor of the archaeological firm or a straight project partner as part of the project team?
I think that probably the easiest way to go about it would be to just have them as a subcontractor of yours or as of the archaeological firm. I feel like of the archaeological firm would be harder, but
it is surprisingly that is the tribe's preferred method. So they're trying to be as much as possible, really, and so they feel a little stronger being underneath the governance of archaeologists versus the straight grant. Mostly, I think they have some challenges on the insurance side of things.
Okay.
In their mind, that it's the insurance requirement. Does.
Okay.
So the tribes struggle to meet the insurance requirements as required by the grant. I think that might be one of our biggest challenges.
Okay. That's helpful. Yeah, I had found some information about some grants who've used tribal resource monitors before. And so I'll dig back into that and just see if there's specific information about the insurance requirements and how the tribes met them. Any other kind of lingering questions?
I had kind of a follow-up, just general question.
Yeah.
Your solicitation says you guys have $3 million available. It's obviously one of the smaller portions of funding that you guys have. Do you guys have a sense of how many projects that you guys would like to fund at your, I mean, I know there's no official cap, but do you guys have a sense of what you guys are looking for as far as maximum? I have 2 projects I'd like to submit, and it's obviously more than you guys have available, so that's not going to work. But you know, just any kind of anecdotal thoughts that you guys have towards that.
The short answer is no, Aaron. Because our board does all of the awarding, it's really ultimately up to them. You know, we can recommend however many projects, but ultimately it's the board's decision, which I know is not a super helpful answer for applicants. We were asked the same question on the last workshop. We will be putting the list of the concept proposals received. I'm not certain if we're going to put them on the website, but the list of the received concept proposals will be available.
Okay.
And so hopefully that would give you some, I don't know, you know, a little more
sense of the competition.
Yeah. So you know, if you want to basically, you know, do the lift that is the full application.
Certainly. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Another suggestion I'd like to point out is to try to make your proposals or your projects, I won't say modular, but like separable or modular. So if we can't find, you know, a full $2 million proposal, maybe our board would be interested in supporting a component of it to get you guys funding one way or another. So just think of that when you are developing your proposals. If you could make it kind of modular or severable, that could be a way to get funding that may be successful.
All right, well, I am going to let us all go. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you find that you have questions as you're preparing your concept proposal or after. We are all here to help. And so we want to make sure that we get all of our pot of funding into awesome Delta projects. So please let us be of assistance. And thanks so much for coming.